Jake Thornton stood on the train platform, hat in hand, watching the last passenger step down. His mail-order bride wasn't there. What stepped off instead was a small Chinese woman with warm boots and eyes that held more stories than his grandmother's Bible. She looked right at him, bowed slightly, and said in broken English, "You Jake Thornton?" His world just got a whole lot more complicated. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly as Jake stared at the telegram in his weathered hands for the third time. Bride unable to travel. Sending replacement, McAllister matrimonial. Replacement? He'd paid good money for a proper Christian woman from back east. Someone who could cook, tend house, and give him sons. This. The Chinese woman stood perfectly still beside her single cloth bag, hands folded, waiting. Her name, she'd said, was May. Just May. She couldn't be more than 25, but something ancient lived behind those dark eyes. The other folks on the platform stared and whispered, some with curiosity, others with the kind of look that made Jake's jaw tighten. "You speak English?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Some," she replied, her accent thick but her tone steady. "I work hard, cook good. No trouble." Jake looked around at the gathering crowd. Old Mrs. Henderson from the general store was already whispering to the banker's wife. Word would spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. A Chinese woman, in his house. What would people say? But winter was coming, and his ranch was too far from town to make regular trips for supplies. He needed help, needed someone. The advertisement had promised him a wife, but maybe what he really needed was just someone who wouldn't run. "Can you handle horses?" he asked. "I learn." Jake picked up her bag, lighter than his saddle, and nodded toward his wagon. "Come on then. We'll sort this out back at the ranch." As they rode out of town, Jake felt the weight of stairs following them. He glanced sideways at May, who sat straight-backed and silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Something told him his quiet, predictable life had just ended forever. 3 weeks in, and Jake realized he'd been living like a savage. May had transformed his bachelor cabin into something that smelled of herbs and clean wood instead of whiskey and loneliness. She could cook better than anyone in town, mended clothes with tiny, perfect stitches, and somehow made his cantankerous old rooster stop attacking visitors. But the trouble wasn't inside his cabin. It was everywhere else. Jake Thornton's got himself a China girl. Old Pete Morrison spat into the dirt outside Carson's saloon. Ain't natural. Ain't right. Jake's fist connected with Pete's jaw before he could think twice. As Pete hit the ground, Jake realized he'd just crossed a line, defending her. When had that happened? Worse yet, May had started asking questions about the burns on his hands, about why he lived alone so far from town, about the woman's clothes hanging in the back of his wardrobe that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "Your wife," she said one evening, not asking. "She die?" Jake's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. 3 years, and no one had dared speak Sarah's name in his presence. "Fire," he said finally. "House fire. I wasn't there." May nodded, her face showing no pity, just understanding. "Is why you live here. Far from people. People talk too much. People hurt," she said quietly. "You hurt," is same. That night, Jake found himself talking to someone for the first time since Sarah died. About the ranch, about the long winters, about how quiet everything had become. May listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to truths he'd been avoiding. When he finally went to bed, Jake realized he'd lost something important that evening. The wall he'd built around his heart had developed its first crack. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by young Tommy Watson, who wouldn't meet Jake's eyes when he handed it over. The return address made Jake's blood run cold. McAllister Matrimonial Services, Boston. "Mr. Thornton," it read, "we regret to inform you that there was an error in our arrangements." The woman sent to you was not authorized by our agency. She is a runaway who stole the real bride's ticket and identification. We demand her immediate return to San Francisco, where certain parties are eager to reclaim their property. Property. Jake's hands crumpled the letter. He found May in the garden. She'd started behind the cabin, carefully tending to vegetables that shouldn't have been able to grow in this rocky soil. She looked up at his approach, and something in his face made her hands still. "You ran away," he said. It wasn't a question. She sat back on her heels, dirt staining her plain dress. "Yes." "From what?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "My father, he sell me to man in San Francisco. Old man, mean man. I could not." Jake remembered the bruises on her wrists when she first arrived, how she flinched when he moved too quickly, how she always kept her back to walls when strangers were around. "They want you back." May's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "You sent me?" Jake thought of Sarah, of the promises he'd made and broken, of the life he'd failed to protect. He looked at this small woman who'd somehow made his house feel like a home again, who hummed while she worked and never complained about the isolation that had nearly driven him mad. "No," he said, "but they're coming for you anyway." That evening, May cooked his favorite meal, beef stew with dumplings that melted like clouds on his tongue. They ate in comfortable silence, both understanding that their time was running out. After dinner, she sat at the table mending one of his shirts, her movements graceful and sure. "Jake," she said without looking up, "if they take me, you remember I was happy here. First time ... happy." Jake's throat constricted. He'd thought he was saving her, but maybe she'd been saving him instead. They came at dawn. 3 men on horseback led by a well-dressed Chinese man with cold eyes and expensive boots. Jake met them in his yard, rifle in hand, while May watched from the cabin window. "Mr. Thornton," the leader called out in accented English. "I am Chun Wei Ming. I have come for my property." "Don't see any property of yours here," Jake replied, his voice deadly calm. "The woman, Mei Lin, she belongs to me. I paid good money for her. People don't belong to other people. Not in my country." Chun smiled without warmth. "Your law says different for Chinese. She is my wife by contract. Her father sold her properly." Jake's finger moved to his rifle's trigger. "She says different. What she says matters little. She comes with me now, or we take her." From behind him, Jake heard the cabin door open. May stepped onto the porch, her chin raised despite the fear in her eyes. "I will go," she said quietly. "No violence. Like hell you will." Jake growled without turning around. "Jake," she said, and her voice broke slightly, "you cannot fight all of them. You cannot fight their law." Chun dismounted, confident now. "Smart woman. Come." That's when Jake noticed the gun in Chun's hand. Not drawn, but ready. The 2 men flanking him shifted in their saddles, hands moving to their weapons. "You want her," Jake said, raising his rifle. "You'll have to go through me." The morning air exploded with gunfire. Jake dove left as Chun's bullet splintered the porch post where his head had been. Rolling, Jake came up firing, catching one of the mounted men in the shoulder. The man screamed and toppled from his horse. But there were still 2 of them, and Jake was caught in the open. Chun was advancing, gun raised, when a deafening boom echoed across the yard. Chun staggered, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest. Jake turned to see May on the porch, holding his old scattergun, smoke still rising from its barrel. "No one owns me," she said in perfect English. The sheriff came that afternoon, drawn by reports of gunfire. Jake and May sat on the porch, watching him approach with the wary patience of people who had nothing left to lose. Sheriff Thompson was a fair man, but Jake could see the calculation in his eyes. A dead Chinese man, a Chinese woman with a smoking gun, a white rancher who'd chosen the wrong side. "Gonna have to take her in, Jake," Thompson said quietly. "You know that. Self-defense," Jake replied. "All of it," Maybe that there'll be a trial. And you know what juries think about situations like this. Jake felt the old loneliness creeping back, cold and familiar. He'd found something worth protecting, and now it was slipping through his fingers like water. "I have money," May said suddenly, hidden from before. "We can go away." "Where?" Jake asked. "They'll find us anywhere. West, Oregon, California. Places where Chinese and white marry. Places where no one asks questions." Jake looked at his ranch, at the life he built from nothing, at the grave marker visible on the hill where Sarah rested. Could he leave it all behind? Again? "Jake," May said softly, taking his hand for the first time. "Sometimes staying is not brave. Sometimes leaving is." That night, Jake sat alone on his porch while May packed their few belongings. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to his turmoil. He thought about Sarah, about promises and duty, and the weight of staying true to the dead versus embracing life with the living. By morning, he'd made his choice. 6 months later, Jake Thornton no longer existed. The man who worked a small farm outside Portland was called John Turner, and he had a quiet Chinese wife named Mary, who tended the most beautiful garden in 3 counties. Some evenings, Jake would catch himself on the porch, watching May marry now, hanging laundry in the golden Oregon light, and marvel at how different his life had become. She hummed while she worked, the same tuneless song she'd sung in Montana, but now there was joy in them instead of resignation. "You miss it?" she asked one evening, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Your old life?" Jake considered lying, then realized he'd done enough of that for one lifetime. "Sometimes. But I missed you more." She smiled, the rare, radiant smile she saved just for him. "Good answer, husband." Husband. They'd married properly in a small ceremony outside Sacramento, witnessed by strangers who didn't care about their past. Jake wore his only clean shirt, and May had fashioned a simple white dress from fabric she'd saved from her former life. When the preacher asked if he took this woman, Jake had answered with the first completely honest words he'd spoken in years. "I do." Now, watching the sun set over Oregon's green hills, Jake realized something profound. He'd spent 3 years trying to bring Sarah back by staying exactly where he'd lost her. But life wasn't about staying. It was about choosing who to walk forward with. "Jake," May said, using his real name in the privacy of their evening. "Tomorrow I start teaching Mrs. Patterson's daughter Chinese. She pays good money." "Good," Jake said, pulling her closer. "We're building something here." "Yes," she agreed, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. Something new. The last light faded from the sky, and Jake Thornton, John Turner, whoever he was now, felt something he hadn't experienced since before the fire. He felt at peace. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying other souls toward uncertain futures. But Jake wasn't listening to what was leaving anymore. He was listening to what had arrived.